welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Welcome back, everybody. We are going to be continuing today to build on the themes over the last couple of weeks and what's going on in our lives and when we're afraid to tell our partner stuff, and then what? What happens after you say it? And saying something vulnerable, especially once we say it out loud. We're not going to talk about the buildup before it, whether we should say it. I mean the part after the conversation ends and two people are left sitting there. Because honestly, that's usually where everything starts changing, not during the confession itself, the after part. Now, before I get into this any further, I want to do as I always do. I want to thank all of you who keep listening, sharing the show, reaching out about, the episodes, commenting, right? I still want to see more engagement from you all. I read all of your messages. I get your private emails, right? From all over the world, right? And if you're new here, welcome. Glad you found your way in and you're listening. If you're following the show on Spotify, right, do me a favor. If you're on the app, go over, click the little 3 dots, rate the show 5 stars. This allows others to keep finding the show, keep hearing these conversations, right? So they can find some sense for themselves or make sense out of the confusion they're dealing with, right? Or if you're following me on YouTube, like, subscribe. That way you'll know when new episodes drop. I'm still dealing with the privacy issue there, but I try to fix that as fast as I can, right? If the show's been useful to you and you want to support it, there is a link in the show's description. Any amount keeps these conversations going. All right. So I've wanted to say something to my partner. I finally said it, right? I actually got it out there. Now, maybe I said it awkwardly. I kind of stumbled my way halfway around through the conversation because, I thought I was going to just lose my nerve trying to pick that right moment, right? But either way, it's out there now. We've said it. It's out of our lips. It's out of our mind. And the other person's heard it. They're maybe going to, process it. They're going to react to it. And now both of you are sitting there with something that didn't exist 10 minutes ago, an hour ago. And what's strange about these moments is technically nothing has really happened yet. Everybody's still present. Nobody's, the world hasn't ended, right? But most of the time, the conversation just ends. Somebody says they need to, they're going to go off and think about it and process it. We say, okay. And then we change the subject because the tension suddenly, it's real. You can cut it with a knife sitting in that room, right? So the two of you go back to doing whatever, you pay your bills, play on the computer, watch a movie, right? And you're pretending everything's normal and everything's fine. But both of you can feel that they're not, the situation's not exactly normal anymore. And that's the shift I want to talk about today, right? Because once something vulnerable and private gets said out loud, people become very hyper aware of each other afterwards. Every pause is suddenly louder, right? Silence feels intentional, right? So now we're replaying that conversation in our head and wondering to ourselves, should I have said this? Did I say too much? Did they misunderstand me? Right? We're searching for all of these cues to come forward. And then we start to wonder if the relationship has now changed in a way neither one of us knows how to deal with. So let's talk about the immediate after. Now, what usually happens next is not another big conversation. Most of the time, it's quiet. The conversation stops. Neither one, leaves it mentally, but we just stop speaking about it directly. And the problem is we're sitting inside of all of this internally. And that's the uncomfortable part that people are rarely prepared for. Saying something vulnerable feels difficult, but the space immediately afterward can feel even worse because now there's nothing to do except exist with the fact that what was said is now out there, right? Pardon me, guys. I've got a little bit of a cough today. So, yes, for those who complain about it sometimes, I can't do much about it. All right. So, what we know is now that it's out there, there's not a major, you know, difference, but it's gradual, right? It's subtle. And now we're wondering if we're going to act too casual, we're going to be too serious, right? We're trying to now settle ourselves while pretending that everything's just okay, right? That it's just still normal. So we're going to go back to it. Like I said, we're going to go back to the things we were doing, right? Because at least what we were doing, the routine, is safe. But underneath it, we are replaying all of this conversation inside of our minds instead of staying present with each other, instead of maybe sitting there and talking it through, even saying, hey, you know what? I need a little bit of time. So if I'm using myself in this scenario and I'm the one who brought this up, I'm going to start questioning myself very quickly, right? Not because, you know, somebody who heard it doesn't, mean that they don't still care or all that, but because being exposed like that creates regret. And sometimes that regret is instant immediately. The brain starts tearing apart the conversations word by word, sentence by sentence, right? Did I explain it wrong? Did I say too much? Did it sound weird? Right? Is my request off? Right? All of this, we're looking. And you can literally watch somebody emotionally retreat in real time after being honest, because now they're staring at the real possibility that they may have changed how the other person sees them. And at the same time, the person who's listening is often having their own reaction privately. Now, I touched base on that last time, right? Because the bottom line was we have to give somebody else time to process our request or our thoughts or our vulnerabilities. So they may be still trying to understand how they feel about the conversation while I'm waiting for an answer. And that's where the tension starts building between two people. One person is searching for reassurance while the other person is still processing what just was said. Now, neither says a whole lot because both people are trying to think before making things worse, right? It's kind of the reverse of a duel here because, whoever moves first, you feel it's going to be awkward and wrong. And then you overthink it and it ends up becoming awkward and wrong. So, what makes this all difficult is how quickly people begin interpreting everything afterwards, right? Tones are different, right? Meaning time feels different. We need to understand that human beings are extremely reactive to any emotional shift once vulnerability is shown, right? Especially when it becomes present. So the moment something personal gets said out loud, awareness increases on both sides. People start paying attention differently, listen differently. And honestly, silence rarely feels neutral after one of these conversations. Even if nothing bad has happened, what often feels like something is just hanging in the air is just unfinished. And so the panic sets in. So that's why people start trying to pull back what they said, minimize it, pretend it didn't really matter as much as it actually did. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because they suddenly want protection from the exposure of having being fully seen in the moment. Now, meanwhile, the other person may already feel pressure themselves to respond to a request, a scene, whatever. Pressure not to hurt the dynamic, right? Pressure not to say the wrong thing while trying to understand how they feel. Mhm. So now both of you are sitting there beside each other, managing this internal explosion going on instead of staying focused on each other and connected to each other directly in the moment. That's the important part. That's usually the real beginning of the shift right there, right? That's what we start noticing. Not the vulnerable sentence, not the silence afterwards, where both people just stop talking, but neither person stops thinking. Let's talk about this silent shift. Now, this is usually the point where people stop feeling fully relaxed around each other, at least for the interim. Not because they suddenly dislike each other or the relationship is going to fall apart, but because something emotionally important has entered the room. And now both people are very aware of it in real time. Even normal interactions start feeling slightly different afterwards, right? And we need to understand this. Being emotionally, sexually, mentally vulnerable changes the room we are in with a partner who didn't know these things previously. It doesn't have to. We talk about we want our vulnerability in our relationships, but then you have to ask yourself, how prepared are we? Are we ready for that vulnerability? I would say yes, but it does take time. You have to build a foundation. You're not, you can start with soft vulnerability in the beginning of your relationships. You don't want to unload something very heavy 2 weeks in. But, 9 months down the road, you shouldn't be just sharing surface level concerns either, right? It's about growth and reception. And every time you're trusting your partner with little acts of vulnerability, it's building that trust foundation together, right? But with something that becomes more personal, much more internal, something, deeply buried inside of us, once it's out there, right? And we're going to know physical affection may change slightly, right? Responses can feel shorter. All of these things are a possibility because we have to remember once, if I say something and I'm looking for a reaction, I need a response. It's not going to be instantaneous because the other person didn't know what I was going to say. So they need to think about it. They've got to deal with what I've said. Then they've got to process it. Then they've got to apply their own feelings to it. And that's a big deal. We have to allow them time. And the bigger the reveal, the bigger the vulnerability that we're bringing forth, the more time somebody's going to need. So once vulnerability gets introduced here into a relationship, this is when the monitoring of each other begins. And it's a real human reaction, right? Our brain starts looking for reassurance, the signs of safety, if we're going to be rejected, right? So now all of our interactions that normally would have passed by unnoticed suddenly carry all this emotional weight because we're placing that on there, right? A delayed reply to a message now feels really significant. My God, she used to text me every day at 3 o'clock. Now it's 3:15. What's going on? She doesn't love me anymore. Same vice versa, right? He doesn't love me anymore. Somebody taking longer to answer something feels more significant, right? All of it, even silence, starts feeling different. Like both people know something is sitting there between them, but neither knows exactly how to touch it without potentially making the situation more uncomfortable. So this is where a lot of overthinking starts becoming aggressive. People replay the facial expressions and the tone, right? And they start wondering why everybody's getting quieter before bed, or sex feels off, or the scenes don't feel as intense anymore, right? Or our conversations are lacking. None of this says anything directly about both people because you're both, the one thing you're doing is trying to avoid adding more tension on top of the tension that already exists. And somebody's going to inevitably ask me, but Chris, why is this tense if I'm being vulnerable and that's what they wanted? Because sometimes when we're vulnerable, our partners don't know how to respond to it. And we have to allow them time to process it. But for the person who was just vulnerable, we've opened ourselves up and it can be a scary place. And I read this and comment after comment and post after post on social media all over, from the vanilla world to the kink world. It exists. People are scared to be vulnerable because it's been used against them. They've had it, they've been made fun of. It's been weaponized, all of these things. So it's very difficult if we are asking to tell somebody something vulnerable and then we are hoping that they can do all that processing and emotional cleansing for themselves and how it applies to their feelings and then give us an answer. And we're talking in a nanosecond. Not everybody's capable of that. And it gets more difficult, like I said, when we get into the real realm of our sexuality or our sexual desires or sexual exploration. Because now we're talking about, am I being viewed differently? But now it's out there, right? Now my partner wants to, they know that I want to be hung upside down while humming the theme from Star Wars while they beat me in the genitals and light my nipples on fire, right? Sounds extreme, and I know a lot of you are going to be laughing and giggling at that, right? Because you're going to imagine that. But the point is, if it's something that somebody wants to explore, right, in this aspect, in that type of scene, that's really extreme for them, but it's a fantasy. But the other person doesn't know how to handle that because they're not into, maybe fire play, or they're not into rope, or whatever the case may be. They just don't envision doing that to their partner. That becomes a very raw part of vulnerability, right? And you have to remember, sometimes people convince themselves that the relationship is now different, right? When in reality, the person is simply just, our partner is just processing. Sometimes the shift is really actually real. It is, right? Because we also have to factor in maybe they're uncomfortable with what we're saying, right? And that's okay too. Just because we're vulnerable, that doesn't mean that it's a guarantee. Some people don't know how to deal with that vulnerability, or it can be overwhelming, or they're processing too something that's too deep inside of them that they've never admitted or spoken about, right? Everything here changes our observation. It changes how emotionally alert people become with each other once vulnerability on something, you know, within us comes out. And because nobody wants to say anything, the wrong way, conversations become restrained and almost scripted. They're no longer natural. We are choosing every word we say, right? We hesitate before we bring anything up because now we're not trying to disturb something fragile, even though neither person fully understands what the relationship is now becoming. And then often we get worried or nervous that we've altered it forever. So now we start having all these internal reactions. Now, what starts happening internally for both people during those stages is usually very different, even if you both look calm on the outside, right? That is the part of what makes these moments feel so isolating. Both people sitting side by side can have two completely separate emotional experiences while, my favorite phrase comes in, everything's just fine, right? So for the person who said the vulnerable thing, or was just open about something inside of them, right? They're the one that's carrying exposure, right? The feeling for them hits the hardest, right? Because once the adrenaline finally wears off, right? It feels like relief because it's out there. But now that it's out there, and especially if you've been carrying this around on your shoulders for weeks, months, years, right? The next thing, God, it's out there, but oh my God, let me grab it and get it back. And you can't. So regret starts coming in. And it's not about regret of the feeling or the thoughts that you've had itself. It's about being perceived of the statement you made, right? So now we are going to question ourselves harsher, right? And now we are going to very much monitor the words we say moving forward after that because we don't want to add to that judgment, right? That loss of control creates anxiety very quickly in a lot of people. And then, my favorite one comes in, shame. And that just starts to show up in little subtle ways, right? Because if our partner no longer discusses the subject and we don't want to bring it up anymore, then we start feeling shameful about ourselves, saying we shouldn't have done this in the first place. And at night, typically gets a lot worse because all we're doing is we're laying there in the dark, replaying these conversations over and over because there's no distraction, there's no movement, there's no noise, right? We're just laying next to our partner. And then we're sitting there wondering what they're thinking about us and the conversation, right? And then that's it, where we just go into this full blown mode of just constantly, you know, enumerating over and over and over, right? In our head. That's all we're doing. Now, on the other hand, the person who heard all of this, the person who you shared this with, something for them is going on completely different inside. Now, they may have had pressure before they even feel, to respond before they understand how they feel yet. They've got to make sure they respond correctly and say the right words. They want to make sure that whatever they say and whatever pressure they feel doesn't make the situation any worse, right? And then they want to make sure that there's no pressure on whatever they decide moving forward doesn't change the relationship because this is out there now. And this type of pressure creates confusion fast because the people that are the listener here assumes that they're supposed to have clarity immediately after the vulnerability enters the room. That's what I was trying to tell you. Most people just don't. That's not very possible because you can't have an answer to something that you didn't know was about to be said. That's going to change a lot of things, including how you feel or what you think until you've had time to process it, right? We need to be able to have that time to emotionally organize my thoughts and my feelings and what I want to do and how this, you know, takes me. Now, some people are faster than others. That's fine. This is not a race. But the problem is that uncertainty itself can create insecurity. So now questions start forming quietly in our heads, right? Am I enough? Was this missing since day one in the relationship? You know, did they really want to do this for longer than I knew? And a lot of people who are in this position begin comparing themselves internally, even if the conversation was never meant to be a criticism. It was just meant to be about exposure and desire or an internal vulnerability that we wanted to get out there. That's the difficult part about being vulnerable between two people. One person may be trying to share honestly while the other person accidentally experiences the disclosure as a reflection on themselves. This happened to me once. I was telling somebody about something in my past and I was talking about how it impacted me, and all they heard was somebody else that I was interacting with some 20 years ago, and that's what they heard. So I have this big disclosure to this person, and I stopped and I looked at him and I said, "That's all you heard. Here I'm pouring my soul out, and that's what you're focused on." And I walked out of the room because it was hurt, right? But more often than not, we're not trying to create tension inside of our relationship. We want honesty. We tell ourselves that. We want vulnerability. We want presence. So sometimes when we're being vulnerable, we have to, preface it a little bit. I want to share something with you. I realize this may take you some time to process, to think. If you have questions, please come and ask. Now, in real time, that really never happens, right? If I could slow every conversation down, that's what I would say. But if I want the room and if I'm going to say something to a partner, the reality becomes, hey, I've got something to say and I just need you to listen right now. Don't ask me questions. Just wait until I'll tell you when I'm done, and then I'll give you some time to think about it and then come back. If I set the tone, then I'm setting my, what my expectations are. But if if they start interrupting me through and they're asking me questions about everything, it's going to change what I'm trying to say, and it's almost going to dilute the process. And then guess what? We retreat and don't say it, right? What we're trying to do is avoid creating emotional distance inside of the relationship just because we're being vulnerable. And it doesn't, if that starts to show up, it's not because either person stopped caring. It's because both people are trying to manage their internal reactions to what's going on privately instead of risking another vulnerable conversation too soon, right? Hey, I'm really struggling with this. And in their head, they know if they tell their partner that, the person who was, just made the disclosure, they're thinking in their mind, well, if I say that to them, all that's going to happen is they're going to say, well, I'm never going to be vulnerable again. And the person who was vulnerable is like, please just say something, right? So I can understand. So it's just this big microcosm going over and over, it's just spinning around and around and around again, over and over in our heads. That's all we do, right? Time is a key factor. This is usually the point where people start making a mistake they believe is helping the relationship. They stop talking about it. Not because the conversation no longer matters, but because it mattered enough to both people to, make them uncomfortable. So there is a quiet unspoken agreement from, it starts forming where neither person wants to reopen the tension, right? So now we start avoiding all of this together because we think that we're just giving them space. The other person thinks they're, the person who was open was backing off to avoid pressure, but underneath it, neither one of you feels settled. And that's where all the distance starts, not fighting or some betrayal. It's just we're going to stop talking. So people act, normal very quickly after something emotionally charged drops. This is one of the most common things human beings do when they feel certain, uncertain, and they feel awkward, right? They return to a routine because routine is stabilizing. Go to work, make dinner, watch show, fold the clothes, really doesn't matter. Talk about errands, politics, anything, right? To get back to something they understand. Anything except the disclosure itself. But acting normal and feeling normal are two very different experiences. And you can feel when two people are very carefully stepping around an emotional landmine, right? Because everything is measured. So instead of the connection returning, both people slowly become more emotionally managed around each other. And the longer you do this, the longer you pull back or you hesitate or you restrict humor, almost all of this eventually at some point somebody's going to bring back up the conversation and then decides halfway through the sentence that the moment is either too heavy or not right, and then you again fail at talking about what was disclosed in the first place. And what makes all of this difficult psychologically is that silence starts becoming interpreted emotionally, whether people intend that or not, because once vulnerability is in the room, avoidance just is natural. It's no longer neutral. The person who disclosed something is watching for every sign out there. And the person who, was on the receiving end has to take time and think about what they're going to say. So if the topic just disappears completely, it starts feeling meaningful. Now every thought starts forming privately before we say it, right? Maybe we don't want to deal with it. Maybe we're too uncomfortable. The person who said it's like, I'm never going to bring anything up ever again, right? We can think of all these phrases. But the other person genuinely believes that they're just helping by not forcing the conversation too quickly. Both of you, in essence, you're overcompensating for the other person. And this is usually where relationships begin drifting emotionally after vulnerable moments, not because the original conversation destroyed anything, but because both people slowly stopped being emotionally transparent afterwards. And honestly, people often do this while they still love each other very much. And that's the sad part. Two people can share and care and be open about the relationship while simultaneously creating more distance because neither one of you knows how to run to safely return to the discomfort together. So instead of, you know, solving that problem and working through the awkwardness, you begin organizing, your behavior around avoiding it. So the relationship starts looking normal again from the outside. And inside, though, something has become different. And then if this patterns for our future, we start telling ourselves, I'm never going to disclose again. I don't, I'm going to suppress some of my desires. I'm going to, I'm not going to, I'll just keep it the same. Why change it? But time, conversations, and openness are what matters. Now, before I get into this next part, this episode is supported by Nothasar. Not everything in intimacy is about pushing limits. Sometimes it's just about having something different to explore together, something that doesn't feel routine. Nothasar makes pieces that let you do that. Different textures, experiences, things that get you paying attention again instead of just repeating what you've tried. It's not about jumping into the extreme. It's about having the choice to explore something new at your own pace and see what actually works for you. If you're curious, take a look at what they have to offer. The link is in the show's description. All right, let's get back to it here. So, what actually keeps this all from falling apart? These become the moments from turning the quiet disconnection, you know, I, and letting it fall apart because we're not going to have a follow-up conversation, right? Not immediately having a right answer is typically how it's going to work after something vulnerable has been disclosed. But most of the time, it comes down to whether both of you are prepared to tolerate the discomfort long enough to remain emotionally present with each other instead of reacting against it. Now, we have to consider factors. The older we get, the more stuff we've got going on, right? Job, school, family, kids, relationships, if we're married, right? How about our own internal struggles and fears? Right? We're balancing all of these things all at once. So we need time. We have to learn to set parameters. We have to learn to say and talk about scheduling things that we don't avoid. If we do, we set a dangerous precedent for the relationship, right? But we also have to allow time for our partners to deal with the stuff that's just uncomfortable. Not because it's intentional, it's just uncomfortable. And we have to allow them to, have their peace. What if they disagree? That's fine. They're allowed to, right? If they don't want to, I don't know, do public dogging sex or whatever, that's not a condemnation. Maybe they're just not into it. If they don't, um, I don't know, they don't cry when old Yeller got shot. That's not a condemnation. Everybody reacts to things differently, right? All of these things, right? We just got to remember once vulnerability enters the relationship, somebody wants certainty very quickly. That's usually the person doing the disclosure, right? We want it for stability. We wanted it to know right away. We want that certainty because we want to know we're okay. We want to make sure this didn't change anything and what's going to happen next. We need that conclusion because that uncertainty feels emotionally difficult to sit inside of more so than the vulnerability itself. But all the major damage that gets created afterwards is when somebody is trying to force a resolution before either one of you has had a chance to understand what they fully are feeling about what was said. And you can usually feel when somebody emotionally leaves the room afterwards, right? That longing stare, they're less natural, right? Honestly, all that awkwardness is normal. You just got to allow that space. I know awkwardness is uncomfortable, but again, plan the conversation, right? I've got something to tell you. I'm a little nervous about. You can preface it. The more vulnerable, sometimes adding your feelings on top of the vulnerability help, right? People expect emotionally important moments to somehow feel clear and mature once they happen, but most real conversations don't work that way. Sometimes both people feel uncertain for a while, and there are going to be pauses that feel uncomfortable. The relationship can feel slightly fragile for a few days because both people are more emotionally aware of each other than normal, and that's okay. That alone doesn't mean something is broken. It just usually matters more is whether the relationship can stay on its course through that awkward moment moving forward. Whether you can have a conversation and and you can both still exist in the same space without one of you immediately needing to shut it down internally. And people feel the difference because somebody needing time and somebody disappearing emotionally are not the same experience. A lot of relationships start deteriorating because both people begin protecting themselves from any discomfort that they are manufacturing sometimes themselves instead of staying connected through it. Remember the things that you've already faced together, right? Because if the next move becomes we're not going to talk about this or we're going to shut this person down or we don't if somebody stops bringing things up because they regret being vulnerable and the other person avoids returning to the conversation because they're afraid of making things worse, all you two are doing is waiting for the tension to fade on its own while slowly becoming less emotionally honest with each other in the process. So you're signaling the end. Vulnerability isn't the roadmap to the ending of a relationship. It's the further foundation and the concrete in the foundation. Look at it as a way to build the relationship, not run from it, not destroy it. If you do anything else, time is okay. Bigger disclosures require more time to process. That's okay. We can allow that. But Chris, I don't know how to do this. You preface it. I need to tell you something, and this is going to be, difficult for me to say, or, I've had this desire and it might sound odd, so I just need you to listen. And then I know it's going to take you some time, so I'm not going to bug you about it. We have to put ourselves in the mindset of our partners if we want them to listen and hear us and respond and remove their tension a little bit, right? Because then our partner who's listening is going to say, okay, great. They're going to give me some time. And then you can just agree, you know what? I need a day. I need a couple of hours. I need, 20 minutes to think about, I don't know. You want to insert a football, right? Never thought about that way, or um, something very traumatic happened and they need time to process it, because that's why we've always retracted it dirt. And when they've grabbed our hand, it's nothing to do with them. It's why we retracted. We need time to process. Human beings aren't computers. They're not instant, right? All of these moments, we have to just be prepared and not rush into fixing it. And we're not rushing to escape from that discomfort. We have to stay emotionally available long enough so that we understand that the vulnerability didn't immediately cost a connection. That what we're telling our partners is that you being vulnerable is great. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel closer to you. I just need time to process what you said. Now, none of this guarantees everything works out perfectly. Some conversations still change relationships. Some people still realize difficult truths about each other. But most relationships don't fall apart because somebody finally said something honest. They fall apart because once the discomfort arrived, the people slowly stopped meeting each other inside of it. Now, as I wind this down today, a lot of people think that the hardest part of vulnerability is finally saying the thing out loud. Sometimes it is. But honestly, what usually changes relationships is what happens afterwards, that silent period, the overthinking, an emotional withdrawal. It's where everybody either starts moving closer and they work through the discomfort, or they start drifting apart while pretending everything is okay. That's the hard part. That's the uncomfortable part. Because saying something vulnerable does not automatically damage a relationship. What damages relationships is when two people stop being emotionally reachable once discomfort enters the room. One person starts protecting themselves, and maybe they start becoming more quiet, and the other person starts avoiding the topic entirely. Now both of you are reacting to fear instead of staying connected to each other. And the difficult part is that this rarely looks, loud or present or even dramatic while it's happening. Most relationships don't suddenly collapse in just a moment. There's just a gradual loss of openness, a loss of honesty, right? Where two people who made this relationship stop bringing up important things to each other because the emotional risk feels too high. But relationships that survive these moments usually are not the ones where everything, immediately felt comfortable afterwards. They are the ones where both people stayed emotionally present long enough to move through that awkwardness instead of organizing the relationship around avoiding it. Because once something is said, the relationship changes a little either way. Even if the relationship becomes stronger because whatever was vulnerable was said, right? Awareness around it changes. Both people now know something they didn't know before. And now they have to decide what to do with that knowledge emotionally. So the question I want to leave you today with, right? When something vulnerable gets said in your relationship, do you stay emotionally present afterward? Or do you quietly start pulling away? When something is said, You don't go back, right? You either move through it or you move away from it. I want to hear you all in the comments, right? And I want you all to talk about this a little bit. Vulnerability is a big subject, especially when we're talking about our relationships, our dynamics. Um, I did warn you all a few weeks ago. I'm very happy to be working with Nathasar. You need to check them out. Their toys are out of this world. It's not because I'm pushing just because of me working with them, but experience is the only way I'm going to be. I'm candid. You all know I'm private. But take a look. There's nothing. You have no harm in looking. Go take a look. All right. I want you to all talk about vulnerability, awkwardness, maybe even recount how a partner supported you through, how you felt afterward. Right. I want you to think about that conversation I talked about last year where there was a Dom in the show, right? We were talking about something different and he disclosed something. But there was that millisecond in there, that nanosecond when he said it, and he was like, oh my God, it's almost over. But his partner just, cool, let's go. Right? Sport was instantaneous. Not every conversation's going to end that way. Theirs did. Their relationship continues to grow. Right? Maybe for some of you, you've said something and somebody walked away. All these things, when you guys talk about this stuff afterwards, helps each other, right? Because the world feels a little less small. Also, random acts of kindness. I want to still see them. I want to hear about them, right? If you don't want to talk to them about out loud, throw me an email. This is what I did. There's a beach cleanup I'm going to. It's cold where I'm at. I'm really reluctant because I'm just, yeah, like it's cold. It's already cold weather, and then the wind and the water and the sea air. It's cold, but it's the beach, and I love the beach, and I want to clean. So I'm gonna go. I'm donating an hour of my time, and I'm gonna go like pick up bottles and trash. Hopefully, there's not a lot, but my God, people are terrible. They throw shit. So I want to hear you guys talk about that too. All right. So here's your question one more time. When something vulnerable gets said inside of your relationship, do you stay emotionally present or do you start pulling away? Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.